Let's talk about flow elements, and remember, this is an overview. We're going through these briefly, but we'll talk about these in depth when we get them in as part of the use cases. The first element we have is a screen, and a screen is an element in a screen flow that you can use to collect user input. You can add a text input field to ask for something like first name. We also have a subflow element. We use it to call an auto-launched flow. We have an action element to send an email or trigger an email alert or trigger a custom notification. In regards to the yellow elements, we have an assignment where we would take one value and assign it to a variable or a field or a resource. And then we can loop through a bunch of records or a collection of records. We also have a collection filter. If we have a collection of records, say a list of opportunities, some of them are closed won and some of them are closed lost, and we would like to grab the won opportunities only, we can filter them down to won opportunities only. We can also sort these opportunities by closed date or by created date. A decision is basically an if statement. If X is met, do this. If Y is met, do that. And we have a transform element, which I like to think of it as a super assignment. You can assign a value to a record or a record collection. You can assign from a collection to another collection. It has a ton of features. You can replace a loop and an assignment with just one transform element. We'll see all of that in action later on. Now let's look at the pink elements. We have the create to basically create a record in the database, and then update that record, query a record from the database, and then delete a record. We also have a rollback, and while we will talk about transactions later, if you ran some flow to create an account and an opportunity, the account was created successfully, the opportunity failed. In that case, you don't want that to happen. You want either both of them get created or both of them fail. In that case, you would use a rollback. If an error happens, then roll back the entire transaction. Don't send anything to the database, roll back everything. We also have a very important concept, and this one while this is an overview, this is something important that we need to remember, that it exists. We don't have to remember the numbers. The concept is that Salesforce is a multi-tenant environment, meaning there is shared resources. Customer A has a Salesforce org, customer B has a Salesforce org. Both of them are having the same infrastructure. They might share the same servers, they might share the same network, they might share some storage. So Salesforce has implemented some limits to make sure that customer A processes do not affect customer B. And the good thing about it is that it enforces efficiency. Because there are limits, you will have to be efficient with your processes. The most common limits are as follows. We have a DML, a data manipulation language, and this is when you would create or edit records in the database. So if you perform any create or edit, that's considered a data manipulation language. And the limit here is 150 per transaction. I promise we'll talk about transactions later, but for now, you don't even have to remember these numbers. Just know that there is a limit on the DML statements. And there is also SOQL, Salesforce Object Query Language. We have a limit of 100. And an example of this is a get element. That's when we query. You can only perform 100 queries in one transaction. We have a CPU time limit that's 10,000 milliseconds. And this is like when you perform some logic that takes a lot of time to process, then you might hit that limit, which enforces simplicity. Try to make things simple so that it's easier to calculate. And there is a SOQL records. When you perform a SOQL query, you retrieve some records from the database. The maximum that you can retrieve from SOQL queries is 50,000 records. Now, you do not have to remember any of those numbers. It's just important to know that they exist so that when you build flows, you try to be as efficient as possible. And Remember, if you're building for a small organization or you're building for a large organization, it's important to be mindful of these limits and build efficient flows, because you might get away with a few additional DML statements that you didn't need, or a bunch of SOQL queries that you didn't need. But this is going to happen when the organization grows in terms of number of records, number of users, the storage being used, the processes that are running. Once the organization grows, then these problems are going to show up, and fixing them then is much more difficult than accounting for these limits early on. Now let's talk about consumption. When you use a create element, that consumes 1 DML. If you use an update element with a filter criteria, it's going to consume 1 SOQL plus 1 DML. If you use an update element without a filter criteria, it's going to perform 1 DML. It's going to consume 1 DML only. If you use loops are like the biggest culprit. That's the one that would consume the CPU time. If you have a loop inside the loop, that's very likely when it's going to happen. You will see that the CPU limit, error limit. And then we have a get element, which consumes 1 SOQL, and then we have a delete element, which consumes 1 DML.